The Genetic Intervention, 10 Protocols to Rewrite Your Metabolic Destiny. It begins as a ghost in the helix, a silent inheritance passed down through generations, whispering that metabolic collapse is inevitable. For millions, a family history of type 2 diabetes feels like a predetermined sentence written in their very blood. But modern medical investigation reveals a startling truth. Genetics loads the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger. By decoding the body's complex signaling pathways, we can biologically override hereditary risks and arrest the disease before it ever takes hold. This is the blueprint for metabolic defense, beginning with the most critical metric of physical health.
The metabolic siege, decoding the visceral fat threat and the 10% solution. To understand the primacy of weight management in the prevention of type 2 diabetes, one must first dismantle the antiquated notion that body fat is merely a passive storage depot for excess energy. For decades, the medical establishment and the general public viewed adipose tissue as inert, a cosmetic nuisance, or a simple caloric bank account. This perspective has been proven dangerously obsolete by modern endocrine research. We now understand that body fat, specifically the visceral adipose tissue, VAT, located deep within the abdominal cavity, acts as a highly aggressive, biologically active endocrine organ. It does not simply sit there. It communicates, it secretes, and it attacks. When a family history of diabetes exists, the genetic architecture is already susceptible to metabolic dysfunction, but it is the accumulation of visceral fat that acts as the accelerant, turning a predisposition into a pathology. The correlation between central obesity and insulin resistance is so robust that it is arguably the single most predictive factor in the development of the disease, overshadowing age, ethnicity, and even specific genetic markers in many longitudinal studies. The mechanism by which belly fat drives diabetes is a study in biological warfare. Unlike subcutaneous fat, the pinchable fat found just under the skin of the arms or legs, visceral fat enwraps the vital organs, including the liver, pancreas, and intestines. As these fat cells or adipocytes expand due to caloric surplus, they eventually reach a critical threshold of hypertrophy. When a fat cell expands beyond its capacity to be oxygenated by the surrounding capillary network, it enters a state of cellular distress. In response, these distressed cells begin to die and release a cascade of inflammatory cytokines, including interleukin-6, IL-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha. This creates a state of chronic low-grade systemic inflammation. This inflammation disrupts the insulin signaling pathway at the cellular level. Essentially, the visceral fat is screaming a chemical signal that jams the body's communication network, preventing insulin from docking effectively with receptors on muscle and liver cells. The result is that glucose, unable to enter the cells for energy, remains trapped in the bloodstream, forcing the pancreas to pump out even more insulin in a desperate,
failing attempt to lower blood sugar. Furthermore, the anatomical location of visceral fat makes it uniquely dangerous due to the portal theory. Visceral fat drains its fatty acids and inflammatory byproducts directly into the portal vein, which serves as the main blood supply to the liver. This means the liver is constantly bathed in a toxic stream of free fatty acids and inflammatory markers. This influx forces the liver to synthesize more glucose and triglycerides, exacerbating high blood sugar and cholesterol simultaneously. This phenomenon, known as hepatic insulin resistance, is often the first domino to fall in the progression toward full-blown type 2 diabetes. The liver, which should shut down glucose production when insulin is present, loses its sensitivity to the stop signal. It continues to pump sugar into the blood even when blood sugar levels are already high, creating the classic fasting hyperglycemia seen in prediabetics. This biological cascade underscores why waist circumference is a far more critical vital sign than body mass index, BMI. A person can possess a normal BMI but carry a high amount of hidden visceral fat, a condition often termed TOFI, thin outside, fat inside, and be at significantly higher risk than a heavier individual with subcutaneous fat distribution. The intervention required to halt this process is surprisingly specific and scientifically validated, a weight reduction of 5 to 10%. This figure is not arbitrary. It is derived from the landmark Diabetes Prevention Program (DPP) study, a massive clinical trial that reshaped our understanding of metabolic health. The study found that for every kilogram of weight lost, the risk of developing diabetes dropped by 16%. A 7% weight loss combined with moderate activity reduced the incidence of diabetes by 58% overall, and by a staggering 71% in adults over age 60. This efficacy outperformed the leading diabetic medication metformin by a significant margin. The physiology behind this 10% solution is profound. When the body enters a caloric deficit, it does not burn fat evenly from all stores. Evolutionary biology dictates that the body preferentially mobilizes visceral fat first because it is metabolically more active and easier to break down than stubborn subcutaneous fat. Therefore, a modest weight loss of just 15 or 20 pounds often results in a disproportionate reduction of the dangerous liver and pancreatic fat.
This declogging of the organs allows the beta cells of the pancreas to recover function and restores the liver's insulin sensitivity almost immediately. However, the modern environment is engineered to oppose this necessary reduction. We live in an obesogenic landscape where hyperpalatable, calorie-dense foods are ubiquitous, and physical exertion has been engineered out of daily life. For those with a genetic predisposition, the hunger-signaling hormones, ghrelin, which stimulates appetite, and leptin, which signals fullness, are often dysregulated. This is not merely a lack of willpower, it is a biochemical imbalance where the brain essentially cannot hear the signal that the body has sufficient energy reserves. Therefore, the strategy for prevention must move beyond vague advice to eat less. It requires a tactical approach to caloric density. The directive to cut sugary drinks is the highest yield maneuver because liquid calories possess zero satiety. When one consumes a soda or a sweetened coffee, the fluid passes through the stomach rapidly, providing a massive caloric load without triggering the stretch receptors in the stomach lining or the release of satiety peptides like PYY or GLP-1 in the intestines. The brain literally does not register that food has been consumed. Eliminating these ghost calories can often result in the necessary 5% weight loss without any other significant dietary modification. The secondary protocol, reducing portions and walking daily, addresses the energy balance equation from both sides. When weight is rising fast, it indicates a significant surplus of energy intake over expenditure. The portion distortion of the last 40 years has normalized serving sizes that are 2 to 3 times the physiological requirement. By recalibrating portion sizes, one reduces the sheer volume of glucose and lipids the system must process at any one time. Coupling this with daily walking creates a metabolic sink. Even low-intensity walking activates the slow-twitch muscle fibers, which are highly efficient at oxidizing fatty acids. This daily movement prevents the accumulation of new visceral fat and encourages the mobilization of existing stores. It is a slow, methodical extraction of the toxin, fat, from the vital organs. Ultimately, maintaining a healthy weight to prevent diabetes is an act of reclaiming biological sovereignty. It involves recognizing that in a family with a history of the disease,
the margin for error is razor thin. The body cannot tolerate the excess adiposity that a person without that genetic variant might handle with ease. The 5 to 10% weight loss target is not a cosmetic goal. It is a medical intervention as potent as any pharmaceutical. It resets the metabolic thermostat, quiets the inflammatory storm of cytokines, and unburdens the liver and pancreas, allowing the body's natural homeostatic mechanisms to function as designed. It is the foundational defense upon which all other preventative measures rest.
2. The glucose spike, navigating the toxicity of sugar and refined carbohydrates. If visceral fat is the stored ammunition of type 2 diabetes, then sugar and refined carbohydrates are the rapid-fire triggers that detonate the metabolic explosion. To deeply investigate the second pillar of prevention, we must look beyond the simplified concept of calories and examine the specific hormonal impact of food quality. The human body was evolutionarily designed to process carbohydrates in their cellular, fibrous form, tubers, whole fruits, and rough grains that required significant enzymatic effort to break down. This slow digestion ensured a trickle of glucose into the bloodstream, matched perfectly by a gentle release of insulin. The modern industrial food system has completely subverted this architecture. Through the processes of milling, refining, and extraction, we have stripped carbohydrates of their fiber matrix, effectively pre-digesting them before they even enter our mouths. The result is not nutrition, it is a biochemical assault. When one consumes refined carbohydrates, white bread, white rice, pasta, or sugary beverages, the physiological reaction is violent and immediate. These simple starches are converted into glucose in the mouth and upper small intestine with frightening speed. Within minutes, blood glucose levels skyrocket, creating a hyperglycemic spike. This spike is the primary insult to the vascular and metabolic systems. High concentrations of glucose in the blood are toxic. They damage the endothelial lining of blood vessels via oxidative stress and the formation of advanced glycation end products, AGEs. The body, sensing this immediate danger, commands the pancreas to release a massive surge of insulin to shuttle the glucose out of the blood and into cells. This is the insulin spike. Over time, if this cycle is repeated multiple times a day, breakfast cereal, a sub-sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner, the insulin receptors on the cells become desensitized. They downregulate to protect the cell from being overstuffed with glucose. This is the genesis of insulin resistance. The specific villainy of sugar, sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup, HFCS, requires a deeper chemical analysis. Sucrose is a disaccharide composed of 50% glucose and 50% fructose. While every cell in the human body can utilize glucose for energy, only the liver can metabolize fructose in significant quantities.
When a person drinks a large soda or eats high-sugar candy, the glucose spikes insulin, but the fructose slams into the liver like a tidal wave. The liver, overwhelmed by this sudden influx of energy substrate, has no choice but to convert the fructose directly into fat via a process called de novo lipogenesis. This is the direct manufacturing of visceral fat and liver fat from sugar. Thus, sugar is a double-edged sword. The glucose drives insulin resistance in the muscles, while the fructose drives insulin resistance in the liver. This dual toxicity makes sugar and refined carbs the most potent drivers of the diabetes epidemic. The historical context of this dietary shift is critical to understanding the magnitude of the problem. For thousands of years, white flour was a luxury item, difficult to produce and consumed only by the aristocracy. The Industrial Revolution brought steel roller mills in the late 19th century, allowing for the rapid, cheap separation of the bran and germ from the endosperm. This created a shelf-stable white flour that was devoid of fiber, vitamins, and minerals, essentially pure starch. Then came the dietary dogma of the late 20th century. In the 1970s and 80s, the demonization of dietary fat led to the reformulation of thousands of food products. To maintain palatability when fat was removed, manufacturers added massive amounts of sugar and refined starches. The low-fat era inadvertently ushered in the high-sugar era, leading to a catastrophic rise in obesity and diabetes rates that correlates almost perfectly with the increase in carbohydrate consumption. We are currently living in the wreckage of that nutritional experiment. The preventative strategy here, cutting back on these substrates, is not merely about restriction. It is about managing the glycemic load of the diet. The goal is to flatten the glucose curve. When blood sugar remains stable, insulin levels remain low. When insulin is low, the body can access stored fat for fuel. This metabolic flexibility is the hallmark of a diabetes-proof system. The directive to limit soda, sweets, white bread, and white rice is an attempt to remove the foods with the highest glycemic index. These are the foods that require the most insulin to process. For a person with a family history of diabetes, their beta cell reserve, the capacity of their pancreas to produce insulin, may already be genetically limited.
Consuming refined carbs is akin to revving a car engine in the red line constantly. Eventually, the engine blows. Preserving beta cell function by reducing the demand for insulin is the only way to ensure long-term health. However, the reality of modern life involves social eating, cravings, and the occasional indulgence. This is where the tactical intervention of what to do becomes vital, the post-meal walk. This is one of the most powerful yet underutilized tools in metabolic medicine. The mechanism involves a different pathway for glucose uptake. Normally, glucose needs insulin to unlock the cell door. However, during muscle contraction, exercise, muscle cells can translocate glucose transporters, GLUT4, to the cell surface independent of insulin. This means that if you walk for 10 to 20 minutes immediately after eating a high-carb meal, your leg muscles will mechanically suck the glucose out of the bloodstream to use as fuel. This blunts the blood sugar spike significantly, reducing the need for the pancreas to overwork. It effectively cancels out a portion of the dietary error. Furthermore, the advice to eat more protein and fiber next meal addresses the reactive hypoglycemia roller coaster. After a high-carb meal and the subsequent massive insulin spike, blood sugar often crashes too low a few hours later. This crash triggers intense cravings for more sugar, creating a vicious cycle of spike, crash, crave. By pivoting immediately to protein and fiber, which digest slowly and have a minimal impact on blood sugar, one stabilizes the system and breaks the addiction cycle. Protein stimulates the release of glucagon, the hormone opposite to insulin, and satiety hormones, helping to restore hormonal equilibrium. In the final analysis, cutting sugar and refined carbs is a declaration of independence from a food system designed to exploit human biology. The combination of hyperpalatability, addictive properties, and cheap availability makes these foods the primary environmental vector for diabetes. For the individual with genetic risk, these foods are not treats, they are metabolic disruptors. The elimination or severe reduction of these agents is not a diet, it is a protective blockade around the liver and pancreas. By understanding the biochemistry of the spike, the toxicity of fructose, and the mechanical utility of the post-meal walk, one gains the upper hand against their genetic programming. We cannot change the genes we were born with.
But by controlling the fuel we put into the engine, we can determine whether those genes express themselves as disease or remain silent, harmless code.
3. The missing matrix, reconstructing the internal barrier against glucose. To comprehend the catastrophic rise of type 2 diabetes in the modern era, one must investigate the single most significant nutritional disappearance in human history, the eradication of fiber. For the vast majority of our evolutionary timeline, the human digestive system was engineered to process a diet defined by immense fibrous volume. Anthropological data suggests that our Paleolithic ancestors consumed upwards of 100 grams of fiber daily, derived from fibrous tubers, tough roots, wild berries, and unrefined seeds. Today, the average American consumes less than 15 grams. This is not merely a dietary shortfall, it is a structural collapse of our digestive architecture. Entry number 3 in our prevention protocol, add fiber to every meal, is arguably the most mechanically significant intervention available. It is not simply about regularity or digestion. Fiber acts as the primary physical brake on the absorption of energy. Without it, the modern gut is an open floodgate, allowing glucose to rush into the bloodstream with a velocity that overwhelms the metabolic machinery. The biological mechanism by which fiber prevents diabetes is a masterclass in fluid dynamics and biochemistry. We must distinguish between the two primary types, soluble and insoluble fiber. While insoluble fiber, the roughage found in wheat bran and vegetable skins, acts as a bulking agent, it is soluble fiber found in oats, beans, flax seeds, and the flesh of fruits that performs the miracle of metabolic regulation. When soluble fiber mixes with water in the stomach, it hydrates and expands, transforming into a thick, viscous gel. This is not a trivial reaction. It fundamentally changes the viscosity of the chyme, the semi-fluid mass of partly digested food. This gelatinous matrix traps sugar and starch molecules, physically sequestering them from the digestive enzymes that seek to break them down. Imagine the digestive process as a race. In a low-fiber meal, say a plain bagel and orange juice, the enzymes amylase and glucosidase can access the sugar molecules instantly. They snip the chemical bonds, releasing pure glucose, which hits the intestinal wall and absorbs into the blood within minutes. This creates the violent spike in blood sugar discussed in the previous section. Now introduce fiber. When that same meal is consumed with a bowl of fibrous oatmeal or a side of bled beans,
the enzymes must work much harder to penetrate the viscous fiber gel to reach the starch. The release of glucose is slowed dramatically. Instead of a tsunami of sugar, the bloodstream receives a slow, manageable trickle. This reduces the demand on the pancreas, lowering the amount of insulin required to maintain homeostasis. This physical barrier effect is so potent that it can mimic the effects of alpha-glucosidase inhibitors, a class of diabetic drugs designed to slow carbohydrate absorption. However, the role of fiber extends far beyond the stomach. The investigation into fiber's preventative power leads us into the dark anaerobic world of the human microbiome. We are only just beginning to understand that the trillions of bacteria residing in our colon are the gatekeepers of our metabolic health. Fiber is the exclusive fuel source for the beneficial bacteria in the gut. Humans lack the enzymes to digest fiber. It passes through the small intestine intact and arrives in the colon, where it undergoes fermentation by the microbiota. This fermentation process produces short-chain fatty acids, SCFAs, specifically acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Butyrate in particular is a miracle molecule in the context of diabetes prevention. Once produced in the gut, butyrate is absorbed into the bloodstream where it exerts systemic effects. It acts as a powerful anti-inflammatory agent, quelling the systemic inflammation driven by visceral fat. More importantly, butyrate has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity in peripheral tissues and stimulate the release of GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, the very hormone that modern blockbuster weight loss and diabetes drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy are designed to mimic. By eating high-fiber foods, you are essentially stimulating your body to produce its own natural version of these drugs. You are feeding the pharmacy within your gut. When fiber intake is low, these bacteria starve. The microbiome shifts towards a pathogenic profile that promotes inflammation, weakens the gut lining, leading to leaky gut, and exacerbates insulin resistance. Thus, the removal of fiber from the Western diet effectively destroyed the ecosystem that protects us from metabolic disease. The historical context of this defibering of the food supply is a tragedy of industrial efficiency. The advent of steel roller milling in the late 19th century allowed for the complete separation of the bran and germ from the grain,
leaving only the starchy endosperm. This made flour shelf-stable and resistant to pests, which was an economic boon but a nutritional disaster. We effectively engineered the antidote out of the poison. In nature, sugar and starch are almost always packaged with fiber. The fructose in fruit is bound in a fiber matrix. The starch in a potato is surrounded by a fibrous skin. We broke this package. We created acellular carbohydrates, dense, fiber-free energy sources that the human body perceives as a metabolic assault. Reintroducing fiber is an attempt to reconstruct the original food matrix that our genes expect. The tactical application of this knowledge, what to do, revolves around the concept of food sequencing. This is a sophisticated biohack derived from recent continuous glucose monitoring (CGM) studies. The advice to increase fiber first before adding more carbs is not just about quantity, it is about order. Studies have conclusively demonstrated that eating the fibrous portion of a meal first, the salad, the steamed broccoli, the roasted Brussels sprouts, before consuming the starches or proteins, creates a physical mesh in the stomach and upper intestine. This mesh is already in place when the carbohydrates arrive minutes later. This veggie starter strategy can reduce the post-meal glucose spike by 30 to 40%, a magnitude of effect comparable to pharmaceutical intervention. Furthermore, the sensation of satiety provided by fiber is mechanical. The stomach has stretch receptors that signal the brain via the vagus nerve when the organ is physically distended. Because fiber absorbs water and swells, it provides volume without calories. It triggers these stretch receptors, sending a stop-eating signal to the hypothalamus long before one has overconsumed energy. In a family prone to diabetes, where the hormonal satiety signals, leptin, may be blunted, this mechanical signal is a crucial failsafe. It physically prevents the overconsumption that leads to visceral fat accumulation. The cultural shift required to embrace this protocol is significant. We live in a world of beige food, processed, soft, and fiberless. The transition to a high-fiber diet, aiming for 30 to 50 grams a day, requires a deliberate engagement with texture in cooking. It means choosing steel-cut oats over instant, lentils over pasta, and raspberries over juice.
It requires navigating the initial discomfort, bloating, and gas that occurs as the microbiome remodels itself to handle the new fuel source. This discomfort is often cited as a reason to quit, but it is actually a sign of a dormant ecosystem coming back to life. It is the construction noise of rebuilding the gut wall. Ultimately, adding fiber to every meal is a strategy of insulation. It insulates the blood from sugar, insulates the liver from fatty acids, and insulates the body from the ravages of modern food processing. It is the most primal form of protection. By prioritizing vegetables, beans, oats, and whole grains, we are not just eating healthy, we are restoring the functional barrier that stands between our genetic predisposition and the onset of disease. We are re-engineering the food back to its original protective state.
4. The satiation architect. Protein as the hormonal lever against cravings. If fiber is the shield, protein is the anchor. In the turbulent seas of metabolic dysregulation, where blood sugar crashes drive intense cravings and insatiable hunger, protein provides the stability necessary to maintain the course. Entry number 4, prioritize protein to reduce cravings, addresses the neurochemical and hormonal roots of overeating. For individuals with a family history of type 2 diabetes, the battle is often fought not at a dinner table, but in the brain. The drive to consume sugar and refined carbs is not a character flaw, it is a biological imperative driven by fluctuating glucose and dysregulated signaling. Protein is the only macronutrient capable of silencing this noise. To understand the primacy of protein, we must explore the protein leverage hypothesis, a compelling theory in nutritional biology proposed by Simpson and Raubenheimer. This hypothesis suggests that the human appetite is primarily driven by a specific target for protein intake. Our bodies have a finely tuned sensor for amino acids, the building blocks of protein. The theory posits that we will continue to eat, consuming unlimited calories of fats and carbohydrates until we meet our protein requirement. In a modern food environment, where foods are diluted with cheap refined carbs and fats, a person might have to consume 3,000 calories of processed food just to get the requisite amount of protein that their body is screaming for. This protein dilution drives the obesity epidemic. We are overeating energy to get to nutrients. By prioritizing protein, we hack this system. We hit the protein target with fewer calories, and the appetite switch flips to off. The physiological mechanism of protein-induced satiety is orchestrated by a complex symphony of gut hormones. When protein enters the small intestine, it triggers the release of cholecystokinin and peptide YY. These are potent anorexigenic, appetite-suppressing hormones. They travel to the brainstem and the hypothalamus to shut down the hunger signal. Simultaneously, protein is the most effective macronutrient at suppressing ghrelin, the hunger hormone produced by the stomach. While carbohydrates cause a sharp rise and fall in blood sugar, leading to a return of hunger within 2 hours, and fats provide a slow, passive satiety, protein provides an aggressive, active stop signal.
This is critical for preventing the snacking and grazing behaviors that keep insulin levels chronically elevated. Furthermore, protein possesses a unique metabolic characteristic known as the thermic effect of food, TEF. Digestion is an energy-intensive process, but not all calories are created equal. The body burns approximately 20–30% of the calories in protein just to digest and metabolize it. In contrast, the TEF for carbohydrates is only 5–10%, and for fats it is a mere 0–3%. This means that 100 calories of chicken breast yields only about 70 net calories to the body, whereas 100 calories of butter yields nearly 100. This metabolic inefficiency of protein is a massive advantage for weight management. A high-protein diet boosts the metabolic rate, effectively increasing the amount of energy the body burns at rest. For a diabetic phenotype that struggles with energy balance, this metabolic boost is a vital tool in maintaining the healthy weight discussed in entry number 1. The investigation into protein also leads us to the critical importance of muscle mass, or lean body mass. Skeletal muscle is the largest glucose sink in the human body. Under normal conditions, about 80% of the glucose cleared from the bloodstream after a meal is taken up by muscle tissue. Therefore, the more muscle mass one possesses, the larger the reservoir for glucose disposal. However, muscle is metabolically expensive tissue. The body will break it down for energy if it is not maintained. Adequate protein intake is the signal that preserves muscle mass. This is mediated by the amino acid leucine, which activates the mTOR pathway, the master regulator of protein synthesis. For aging populations or those with sedentary lifestyles typical of prediabetes, sarcopenia, muscle loss is a silent killer. As muscle wastes away, the glucose sink shrinks and blood sugar rises. Prioritizing protein is muscle insurance. It ensures that the metabolic engine remains large enough to burn the fuel being put into it. The tactical advice, if sugar cravings hit at night, choose a protein snack, confronts one of the most common failure points in diabetes prevention, the late-night binge. Biologically, evening cravings are often a result of a dopamine-seeking brain combined with crashing blood sugar from a poor dinner. The impulse is to reach for ice cream, cookies, or chips, foods that provide an instant dopamine hit and a glucose spike. This is the worst possible time for a spike,
as insulin sensitivity is naturally lower at night due to circadian rhythms. Intercepting this craving with protein, a hard-boiled egg, a piece of leftover chicken, Greek yogurt, or a handful of almonds, changes the trajectory. The mechanism here is twofold. First, the protein stabilizes blood glucose via gluconeogenesis. Unlike carbs, which dump sugar into the blood, protein can be slowly converted to glucose by the liver if needed, providing a long, stable energy curve that prevents the hypoglycemia-induced panic signal in the brain. Second, certain proteins, specifically casein, found in dairy, clot in the stomach and digest incredibly slowly, providing a steady stream of amino acids throughout the night. This prevents the catabolic breakdown of muscle during sleep and keeps the metabolic fire burning. Replacing a sugar ritual with a protein ritual rewires the brain's reward pathways over time. You are retraining your system to seek sustenance rather than stimulation.
We must also address the source and quality of this protein. The directive includes eggs, fish, lean meat, tofu, and yogurt. This diversity is key. While animal proteins are complete, containing all essential amino acids, plant-based proteins fit of fiber and phytonutrients. The inclusion of fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, sardines, introduces omega-3 fatty acids, which have powerful anti-inflammatory properties that further aid in reversing insulin resistance. The goal is to move away from processed meats, sausages, deli meats, which are often laden with nitrates and sodium that can damage blood vessels, and toward whole, single-ingredient protein sources. The cultural implications of a high-protein approach are vast. We are seeing a shift away from the carbohydrate-heavy food pyramid of the 1990s, which arguably catalyzed the diabetes crisis, toward a more ancestral way of eating. How for prioritization? It means designing the meal around the protein source rather than the starch. Instead of pasta with some meat sauce, the mindset shifts to grilled salmon with a side of vegetables. This psychological flip is essential. Ultimately, prioritizing protein is an act of metabolic signaling. It tells the body we are safe, we have nutrients, build muscle, stop eating. For those with a genetic susceptibility to diabetes, the hunger regulation system is often broken.
The signals are crossed. Protein repairs the communication lines. By ensuring that every meal reaches a threshold of protein, typically 30 grams is the sweet spot for triggering muscle synthesis and satiety, we essentially vaccinate ourselves against the urge to overconsume the sugary, refined foods that drive the disease. It provides the structural and hormonal foundation upon which a diabetes-free life can be built. It transforms the body from a fat-storing vessel into a muscle-building, fat-burning machine.
5. The kinetic prescription, re-engineering the metabolic engine through chronic adaptation. To comprehend the fifth protocol of diabetes prevention, consistent exercise defined as 150 minutes of moderate activity plus resistance training, we must first acknowledge a fundamental anthropological truth. The human body was designed for relentless movement. For 2 million years, the metabolic machinery of Homo sapiens evolved under the pressure of scarcity and the necessity of physical exertion. Our ancestors did not exercise in the modern sense, they moved to survive. They covered vast distances to forage, sprinted to hunt or escape predation, and lifted heavy loads to build shelter. Consequently, our physiology is hardwired to expect a high throughput of energy. We are engineered to be combustion engines. The modern sedentary lifestyle, characterized by prolonged sitting and mechanized transport, represents a catastrophic mismatch between our ancient genes and our current environment. This mismatch theory is the bedrock of the diabetes epidemic. When we stop moving, the fuel, glucose and lipids, backs up in the system, rotting the machinery from the inside out. Therefore, the prescription of 150 minutes is not merely a suggestion for fitness, it is a requirement for biological normalcy. The investigation into the mechanics of exercise reveals that it is the most potent insulin-sensitizing drug available, far surpassing the efficacy of metformin or other early-stage pharmaceuticals. To understand why, we must look at the cellular level, specifically at a transporter protein called GLUT4. In a resting state, glucose cannot enter muscle cells on its own. It requires a transporter. Normally, insulin binds to a receptor on the cell surface, triggering a signaling cascade that moves GLUT4 from the interior of the cell to the membrane, opening the door for glucose. In type 2 diabetes, this signaling pathway is broken. The doorbell rings, but no one answers. Exercise, however, possesses a backdoor key. Muscle contraction triggers the translocation of GLUT4 to the cell surface through a completely separate pathway involving an enzyme called AMP-activated protein kinase AMPK. This means that even if a person is insulin resistant, even if their pancreas is struggling and their cells are ignoring the hormonal signal, exercise can mechanically force the cells to absorb glucose. This insulin-independent glucose uptake is a physiological miracle.
It allows the diabetic or pre-diabetic body to clear sugar from the bloodstream without taxing the pancreas, giving the beta cells a desperate need for rest and recovery. The specific recommendation of 150 minutes per week is not an arbitrary number plucked from the ether by the World Health Organization. It is derived from rigorous epidemiological data indicating the threshold for systemic metabolic change. This duration, which breaks down to roughly 22 minutes a day, appears to be the minimum effective dose required to alter gene expression related to mitochondrial biogenesis. Mitochondria are the power plants of the cell, the organelles where glucose and fat are oxidized to create ATP. Energy. In sedentary individuals, mitochondria become sparse and dysfunctional, leading to metabolic inflexibility, the inability to switch easily between burning fat and sugar. Consistent aerobic exercise, brisk walking, cycling, swimming, signals the body to build more mitochondria and to make existing ones more efficient. This increases the body's oxidative capacity. It essentially upgrades the engine from a 4-cylinder to a V8. With more mitochondria, the body can burn through dietary fuel more efficiently, preventing the accumulation of the toxic lipid intermediates like diacylglycerol and ceramides that cause insulin resistance in the first place. However, the protocol explicitly demands a dual approach, aerobic activity plus strength training.
The inclusion of resistance training is critical because skeletal muscle is the primary glucose sink of the human body. Approximately 80% of postprandial, post-meal glucose disposal occurs in skeletal muscle. Therefore, the size and quality of that muscle tissue determines the body's capacity to handle sugar. We must view muscle not as aesthetic armor, but as a metabolic organ. Resistance training, lifting weights using resistance bands or bodyweight exercises, induces hypertrophy, the growth of muscle fibers. By increasing muscle mass, we are physically building a larger storage tank for glycogen, stored glucose. A person with low muscle mass, sarcopenia, has a very small tank. Even a moderate carbohydrate meal can cause an overflow, high blood sugar. A person with substantial muscle mass has a vast reservoir, allowing them to buffer glucose spikes with ease. Furthermore, recent research has unveiled the role of muscle as an endocrine organ. When muscles contract against resistance,
They secrete chemical messengers called myokines. These are cytokines, signaling proteins, that travel through the bloodstream and exert effects on distant organs. One such myokine, irisin, has been dubbed the exercise hormone. Irisin has the remarkable ability to convert white adipose tissue, the bad inflammatory storage fat, into beige or brown adipose tissue. Brown fat is metabolically active. It burns calories to generate heat. Thus, strength training does not just burn calories during the session, it fundamentally alters the chemical composition of the body's fat stores, turning them from passive, distinct enemies into metabolically active allies. Another myokine, interleukin-6, released acutely during exercise, distinct from the chronic inflammatory IL-6, acts to suppress appetite and improve insulin sensitivity in the liver. This muscle talk highlights that lifting weights is a conversation between the muscles and the rest of the metabolism, instructing the body to lean out and regulate sugar. The challenge of consistency in this protocol is often psychological rather than physical. The modern environment is engineered to conserve energy. Elevators, cars, and remote controls are all designed to minimize movement. Overcoming this requires a cognitive restructuring of what exercise means. It is often viewed as a punishment for eating or a painful chore. For the prevention of diabetes, it must be reframed as a daily hygiene practice, akin to brushing one's teeth. The advice to start with 10 minutes a day addresses the inertia of the sedentary physiology. Biologically, a body at rest tends to stay at rest due to the conservation of energy principle. However, the psychological barrier is often higher than the physical one. By lowering the entry threshold to 10 minutes, one bypasses the brain's fight or flight resistance to discomfort. Once the habit is established, the dopamine feedback loops, the runner's high mediated by endocannabinoids, begin to reinforce the behavior. We must also consider the phenomenon of exercise non-responders. Some individuals, due to genetics, see slower improvements in VO2 max or insulin sensitivity than others. However, the data shows that while the magnitude of response varies, the direction is almost always positive. There is no such thing as a person who does not benefit metabolically from muscle contraction.
The 150-minute benchmark is a population average. For those with a strong family history of diabetes, the requirement might be higher. This is where the concept of metabolic flux comes in. High metabolic flux, high energy intake, high energy output, is the healthy state of the hunter-gatherer. Low metabolic flux, low intake, low output, is a precarious state where any slight overeating leads to fat gain. Exercise moves a person into a state of high flux, where the system is robust and forgiving of occasional dietary errors. The future of this intervention lies in the integration of technology and personalized medicine. Wearable technology, smartwatches and continuous glucose monitors, CGMs, is gamifying the 150-minute goal, providing real-time feedback on how activity lowers blood sugar. We are moving towards an era where doctors will prescribe exercise with the same specificity as drugs, 30 minutes of Zone 2 cardio at 130 beats per minute, followed by 3 sets of compound lifts. But until that future arrives, the raw reality remains. We cannot drug our way out of a disease caused by a lack of movement. The pharmaceutical industry is racing to create exercise mimetics, pills that flip the AMPK switch without the sweat. But these drugs cannot replicate the myriad benefits of physical movement, from bone density to mental health to the sheer hemodynamic force that keeps our blood vessels elastic. In the final analysis, consistent exercise is the signal that tells the body it is alive and required to perform. In the absence of this signal, the body initiates a slow shutdown sequence, conserving resources and becoming insulin resistant to protect itself from what it perceives as a surplus of unneeded energy. By committing to the 150-minute protocol and the discipline of iron, we override the shutdown. We assert our biological vitality. We build a metabolic engine capable of burning through the genetic risks we inherited, proving that while our DNA may load the gun, our muscles can dismantle the weapon entirely.
6. The postprandial stroll, the acute tactical strike against glucose toxicity. While entry number 5 focused on the chronic restructuring of the body's machinery, entry number 6, walk after meals to lower blood sugar spikes, is the acute tactical intervention designed to manage the immediate threat of the fuel load. This strategy, often referred to in medical literature as the postprandial walk, is arguably the single most effective behavioral maneuver for flattening the glucose curve in real time. It transforms the passive act of digestion into an active metabolic event. To understand its profound importance, we must zoom in on the critical 60-minute window following a meal, a period where the fate of one's metabolic health is largely decided. When a person consumes a meal, particularly one containing carbohydrates, the digestive system breaks down starches into glucose, which floods the bloodstream. In a healthy individual, insulin rises rapidly to shuttle the sugar into cells. However, in those with prediabetes or a genetic predisposition, the first phase insulin response is often blunted or delayed. The pancreas is sluggish. As a result, blood sugar levels can soar to dangerous heights, hyperglycemia, before the insulin can catch up. These spikes are not benign. They cause immediate oxidative stress to the endothelial lining of the arteries, contributing to the microvascular damage that leads to retinopathy, neuropathy, and kidney disease. The spike itself is toxic. The goal of prevention is to decapitate these spikes, to shave off the peaks of the mountain. The biomechanics of the post-meal walk leverage the immediate energy demands of the lower body. The legs contain the largest muscle groups in the human body, the quadriceps, hamstrings, glutes, and the calves. When you walk, these huge muscles begin to contract rhythmically. As discussed previously, muscle contraction demands ATP, energy. The muscles look for the nearest available fuel source. In the postprandial state, the bloodstream is saturated with glucose. By walking, you are essentially opening the sluice gates of the muscles, allowing them to drain the glucose directly from the blood to power the movement. This happens almost instantly. Studies using continuous glucose monitors, CGMs, have shown that walking for just 15 minutes starting 30 minutes after a meal can lower the peak blood sugar level by 20 to 30% compared to remaining sedentary.
A critical component of this mechanism involves a specific muscle, the soleus. Located deep in the calf, the soleus is a postural muscle designed for endurance. Unlike the fast-twitch muscles of the thigh, which rely on stored glycogen and fatigue quickly, the soleus is a slow-twitch powerhouse that runs on blood glucose and lipids. Recent groundbreaking research suggests that the soleus is uniquely capable of sustaining high levels of oxidative metabolism for hours without fatigue. When we walk, the soleus is constantly engaged. It acts as a specialized pump, pulling glucose out of the blood and oxidizing it. The soleus push-up, a seated calf raise, has even been identified as a potent metabolic hack for those who cannot stand, but the full activation of the lower posterior chain through walking provides the most systemic benefit. The timing of this intervention is paramount. The directive to walk 10 to 20 minutes after meals is specific because of the digestion curve. Gastric emptying, the rate at which food leaves the stomach, varies, but generally, blood glucose begins to rise 15 to 30 minutes after the first bite and peaks around the 60 to 90-minute mark. If one waits 2 hours to walk, the spike has already occurred, the damage is done. The strategy requires interception. By beginning the walk as the glucose is entering the bloodstream, the muscles consume the sugar as it arrives. It prevents the concentration from ever reaching toxic levels. It effectively hides the meal from the body's glucostat. This reduces the amount of insulin the pancreas needs to secrete, preserving the beta cells from exhaustion. Culturally, this practice is a reclamation of ancient wisdom. In Italy, the tradition of the passeggiata, an evening stroll through the town square, is a cornerstone of social life. It turns out to be a cornerstone of metabolic health as well. In China, the proverb, "walk 100 steps after a meal and live to 99, reflects a similar understanding. Contrast this with the modern American ritual, the TV dinner followed by collapsing onto the couch. This sedentary behavior places the body in a state of postprandial lipidemia and hyperglycemia. The parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode, takes over, diverting blood flow to the gut. But without the mechanical aid of muscle contraction, the clearance of substrates is slow and inefficient.
The food coma is often exacerbated by the glucose spike and subsequent crash. Walking actually invigorates the system, combating the lethargy. The practical application, what to do if you can't go outside, do light movement at home, is crucial for adherence. The barrier to entry must be zero. This does not require gear, gym memberships, or sweating. It is not exercise in the cardiovascular training sense, it is functional movement. Pacing around the living room, doing laundry, or stepping in place while watching television are all effective. The intensity only needs to be low to moderate. In fact, high-intensity exercise immediately after a meal can sometimes be counterproductive, as it diverts blood away from the stomach too aggressively, causing indigestion, or triggers a stress hormone response that releases more glucose from the liver. The sweet spot is a brisk but comfortable pace, zone 1 activity, where one can hold a conversation. This strategy also has a profound psychological impact. It breaks the association between eating and lethargy. It creates a definitive end to the meal. For many overeaters, the period immediately following dinner is a danger zone for snacking. By physically removing oneself from the kitchen and engaging in movement, one closes the eating window. It provides a moment of mindfulness, a time to digest not just the food, but the day's events. It integrates the biological necessity of metabolism with the human need for reflection. Furthermore, we must consider the impact of this habit on the dawn phenomenon. Many diabetics struggle with high blood sugar in the morning due to the liver dumping glucose overnight. Walking after dinner dinner specifically targets the glycogen stores in the liver and muscles before bed. By lowering the circulating glucose and partially depleting glycogen reserves in the evening, the liver is less likely to dump excess sugar into the blood the following morning. It sets the stage for a stable night of sleep and a lower fasting glucose reading the next day. The cultural shift required here is to view movement as the second half of digestion. We have been taught that digestion is an involuntary process that happens to us. The science of the post-meal walk teaches us that digestion is a participatory act. We can actively assist our organs in processing the fuel we provide. For a family battling a genetic legacy of diabetes, this tool is indispensable. It is free, it is immediate,
And it is universally accessible. It turns every meal from a potential metabolic insult into an opportunity for metabolic regulation. By simply putting one foot in front of the other after pushing away the plate, we manually operate the levers of our own biology, ensuring that the food we eat nourishes us rather than destroying us.
7. The nocturnal restoration, circadian rhythms, and the architecture of metabolic repair. To fully grasp the magnitude of entry number 7, sleep 7 to 9 hours on a consistent schedule, we must abandon the cultural misconception that sleep is merely a passive state of rest or a cessation of consciousness. In the context of type 2 diabetes prevention, sleep is a highly active, metabolically critical period of biological reconstruction. It is the time when the body balances its checkbook. For individuals with a genetic predisposition to metabolic disease, the modern erosion of sleep quality and duration acts as a powerful epigenetic trigger, turning silent risk factors into roaring pathology. The science of chronobiology, the study of biological rhythms, reveals that our metabolism is inextricably linked to the rotation of the Earth. Every cell in the human body possesses a clock gene, a molecular timekeeper that anticipates the day-night cycle. When we disrupt this rhythm through sleep deprivation or erratic schedules, we create a state of internal dyssynchrony that the medical community now recognizes as a primary carcinogen and a potent diabetogen. The physiological impact of sleep deprivation on blood sugar control is immediate and terrifyingly potent. Landmark studies conducted at the University of Chicago demonstrated that restricting healthy, young, lean men to 4 hours of sleep for just 6 consecutive nights resulted in a pre-diabetic state. Their ability to process glucose declined by 40%, a deterioration typically seen only in older adults or those already diagnosed with insulin resistance. The mechanism behind this rapid collapse is multifaceted. First, sleep loss creates a state of cerebral glucose hypometabolism, but paradoxically, it causes the body to flood the bloodstream with sugar. This occurs because sleep deprivation elevates the sympathetic nervous system activity, the fight or flight response, which suppresses the release of insulin from the pancreas and decreases the insulin sensitivity of fat cells. Essentially, a sleep-deprived body behaves as though it is under attack, keeping blood sugar high to fuel a defense against a threat that does not exist. Furthermore, the hormonal regulation of appetite completely dismantled by a lack of sleep. 2 key hormones, ghrelin and leptin, act as the accelerator and brake for hunger, respectively. Ghrelin, produced in the stomach, signals the brain to eat. Leptin, produced by fat cells,
signals the brain that energy stores are sufficient. During a full night of restorative sleep, ghrelin levels drop and leptin levels rise, suppressing hunger until morning. However, when sleep is curtailed, this seesaw flips violently. Ghrelin spikes and leptin plummets. This creates a voracious primal hunger that is specifically targeted toward high-carbohydrate, calorie-dense foods. This is not a failure of willpower, it is a survival mechanism gone awry. The sleep-deprived brain, sensing an energy crisis, demands quick fuel. This is why the midnight snack or the craving for a sugary breakfast after a poor night's sleep is almost irresistible. For someone fighting a genetic tendency toward weight gain in diabetes, chronic sleep debt makes dietary adherence physiologically impossible. We must also investigate the role of the glymphatic system, a relatively recent discovery that has revolutionized our understanding of brain health. During deep, slow-wave sleep, the brain cells actually shrink, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to wash through the tissue and clear out metabolic waste products, including beta-amyloid and tau proteins. While often discussed in the context of Alzheimer's disease, this brainwashing is also critical for the hypothalamus, the control center for metabolism. Chronic accumulation of toxins and inflammation in the hypothalamus can disrupt the brain's ability to sense insulin and leptin, leading to central insulin resistance. Thus, deep sleep is the nightly maintenance crew that ensures the central processing unit of our metabolism remains sensitive and accurate. Without this cleaning cycle, the brain loses its ability to regulate the body's energy balance. The historical context of our sleep crisis is rooted in the industrialization of light. For millions of years, the human species lived in a binary environment, bright blue-spectrum sunlight during the day, and darkness or the warm red glow of fire at night. The invention of the incandescent bulb by Thomas Edison and the subsequent LED revolution destroyed this duality. We are now bathed in junk light 24 hours a day. The specific wavelength of blue light emitted by smartphones, tablets, and televisions targets melanopsin receptors in the retina. When these receptors are stimulated at night, they send a signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, in the brain that it is still noon. The SCN then suppresses the release of melatonin,
the hormone of darkness that initiates the sleep cascade. This artificial extension of the day confuses the metabolic organs. The liver, pancreas, and gut, waiting for the signal to shut down and repair, are kept in a state of low-grade arousal. This social jet lag, where our biological clock is out of sync with our social clock, is a significant driver of obesity and diabetes. The tactical intervention, what to do, requires a militant approach to sleep hygiene. The recommendation to reduce late caffeine is based on the pharmacokinetics of the drug. Caffeine is an adenosine antagonist. It blocks the chemical signal that tells the brain it is tired. However, caffeine has a half-life of approximately 5 to 6 hours. If one consumes a coffee at 4 p.m., half of that caffeine is still active in the brain at 10 p.m. While the individual might fall asleep, the quality of that sleep is compromised. The caffeine prevents the brain from entering the deepest stages of slow-wave sleep, where growth hormone is released and glucose regulation is reset. Therefore, a strict caffeine curfew is not a suggestion, it is a pharmacological necessity for metabolic health. Limiting screens before bed is equally critical. The digital sunset protocol suggests turning off all blue light emitting devices at least 60 to 90 minutes before sleep. This allows melatonin levels to rise naturally, lowering body temperature and blood pressure, and preparing the glucose metabolism for its nocturnal fast. For those who cannot disconnect, the use of blue light blocking glasses offers a partial mitigation, but the cognitive stimulation of scrolling through news or social media, which triggers dopamine and cortisol, remains a barrier to the parasympathetic state required for deep rest. Moreover, the aspect of consistency in the schedule, sleeping 7 to 9 hours at the same time every day, is vital. The metabolic machinery thrives on predictability. When you wake up at the same time every morning, a cortisol pulse prepares the body for the day. If this time shifts wildly, e.g. sleeping in on weekends, the body experiences a form of jet lag without ever leaving the time zone. This metabolic confusion impairs the body's ability to anticipate glucose loads. Studies show that people with irregular sleep patterns have higher HbA1c levels and higher BMI, independent of total sleep duration. Ultimately, preventing diabetes requires us to reframe sleep.
It is not a luxury for the lazy, it is the foundation of the metabolic pyramid. It is the period where insulin receptors are resensitized, where inflammation is quelled, and where the hormonal drivers of appetite are reset. In a culture that fetishizes the grind and views sleep deprivation as a badge of honor, prioritizing 7 to 9 hours of darkness is an act of rebellion. It is a declaration that biological integrity matters more than productivity. For the family with diabetes in its lineage, the bedroom is a sanctuary of prevention, and the pillow is a medical device as potent as any pill. 8. The cortisol cascade, managing stress to diffuse the internal glucose bomb. Entry number 8, manage stress to protect blood sugar, invites us into the complex and often overlooked intersection of psychology and endocrinology. While diet and exercise are the visible pillars of diabetes prevention, stress is the invisible current that can undermine even the most perfect lifestyle regimen. To understand why, we must look at the human body's evolutionary design. We are built to handle acute physical stress, a predator, a storm, a rival tribe. In these life or death moments, the body initiates the fight or flight response, mediated by the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis. This system floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol. The primary function of cortisol in this context is to mobilize energy. It tells the liver to dump stored glucose into the bloodstream, gluconeogenesis, and instructs the muscles to ignore insulin, temporary insulin resistance, so that the glucose remains available for the brain and the muscles needed to run or fight. In the Paleolithic era, this sugar spike was life-saving. The physical exertion of fighting or fleeing would burn off the excess glucose, and once the threat passed, cortisol levels would plummet and the system would reset. The problem, however, lies in the nature of modern stress. Today's threats are not saber-toothed tigers. They are mortgages, traffic jams, difficult bosses, and 24-hour news cycles. These stressors are psychological, chronic, and involve zero physical exertion. The body, however, cannot distinguish between a lion and a late bill payment. It reacts to psychological stress with the same ancient biological hardware. It dumps glucose into the bloodstream to fuel a fight that never happens. This results in chronically elevated blood sugar levels in people who may be eating a perfect diet. This phenomenon is known as stress hyperglycemia. The damage caused by chronic cortisol elevation goes deeper than just blood sugar. Cortisol is a catabolic hormone. It breaks down tissues. Specifically, it breaks down muscle tissue to convert amino acids into glucose. As discussed in previous entries, muscle is our primary glucose sink. Therefore, chronic stress literally eats away at our metabolic defense system, reducing muscle mass and lowering our metabolic rate. Simultaneously, cortisol has a specific affinity for visceral fat storage.
High levels of cortisol activate an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, LPL, specifically in the abdominal fat cells. This is why stress is causally linked to the cortisol belly. This visceral fat, as we know, is the factory for inflammatory cytokines that drive systemic insulin resistance. Thus, stress creates a vicious self-reinforcing cycle. Stress raises blood sugar, destroys muscle, and builds belly fat, all of which make the diabetes risk skyrocket. Furthermore, the behavioral impact of stress, the stress-eating phenomenon, is rooted in neurobiology. Cortisol blunts the brain's sensitivity to pleasure, leading to a deficit in dopamine. To compensate, the brain seeks out hyper-palatable foods, specifically those high in sugar and fat, because these foods trigger a temporary dopamine release. This is self-medication through food. The comfort food cravings are not emotional weakness. They are a neurochemical attempt to downregulate the stress response. Sugar actually dampens cortisol temporarily, which reinforces the habit loop. For someone with a family history of diabetes, this loop is a highway to disease. The preventative strategy requires a manual override of the autonomic nervous system. We must learn to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode, which acts as the brake pedal to the sympathetic gas pedal. The most direct way to access this system is through the breath. The recommendation to use deep breathing is based on the physiology of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve, wandering from the brainstem down to the gut. It is the primary controller of the parasympathetic response. When we breathe deeply and slowly, specifically extending the exhalation, we physically stimulate the vagus nerve. This sends a signal to the brain that we are safe. Acetylcholine is released, heart rate slows, and cortisol production halted. The 5-minute breathing routine mentioned in the protocol is not spiritual woo-woo, it is a biological remote control. Techniques like box breathing, inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 4, hold 4, or the physiological sigh, 2 sharp inhales followed by a long exhale, can drop blood sugar levels by lowering the hormonal command to produce glucose. The directive to pause, drink water, and reset when stress triggers overeating disrupts the automaticity of the habit. The pause engages the prefrontal cortex, the rational,
executive part of the brain, which is often taken offline during high stress. Drinking water provides a momentary physical sensation and hydration, addressing the fact that thirst is often mistaken for hunger. But the reset is the crucial component. This might involve a short walk. Entry number 8 explicitly mentions this, which burns off the mobilized glucose and adrenaline, effectively completing the stress cycle. By moving the body, we convince the ancient brain that we have escaped the predator, allowing the HPA axis to stand down. We must also consider the role of nature exposure in stress management. The Japanese practice of shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, has been clinically shown to lower cortisol, blood pressure, and heart rate compared to walking in an urban environment. The mechanism involves the inhalation of phytosides, wood essential oils, and the visual processing of fractal patterns found in nature, which have a soothing effect on the human brain. Even for those in cities, finding a park or green space acts as a metabolic shield. The cultural implication of stress management is profound. We live in an always-on attention economy that monetizes our anxiety. The notifications on our phones are designed to trigger microspikes of cortisol to keep us engaged. To prevent diabetes, one must curate their environment to reduce this allostatic load, the wear and tear on the body caused by chronic stress. This means setting boundaries with work, engaging in digital detoxes, and prioritizing social connection. Loneliness is a stressor as potent as smoking. Positive social interaction releases oxytocin, which directly opposes cortisol. In the final analysis, managing stress is not just about feeling calm, it is about protecting the liver from its own survival mechanisms. For the individual with a genetic loading for type 2 diabetes, the margin for error is small. Their system cannot handle the constant bath of glucocorticoids that modern life provides. By mastering the breath, recognizing the trap of stress eating, and actively down-regulating the nervous system, we stop the internal production of sugar. We tell the body that the war is over, allowing the metabolic peace required for health to return. We transform from a state of constant emergency to a state of resilience.
To investigate the 9th protocol of diabetes prevention, choose water over sugary drinks, we must first confront a staggering evolutionary anomaly. For 99.9% of human existence, the only liquid that crossed our lips was water, occasionally supplemented by the milk of a mother during infancy. The introduction of calorically dense, hyperpalatable liquid sugar into the human diet is a blip on the historical timeline, yet it represents perhaps the single most destructive dietary shift in the history of our species. When we analyze the epidemiology of type 2 diabetes, the correlation with the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, SSBs, is not just strong, it is almost linear. These beverages, sodas, sweetened teas, sports drinks, and even fruit juices, act as a metabolic Trojan horse. They bypass the body's natural satiety mechanisms, delivering a payload of energy that the liver is evolutionarily ill-equipped to handle. The transition from these toxic fluids to water is not merely a dietary adjustment, it is a physiological detoxification and a restoration of the body's primary filtration system. The biochemistry of liquid sugar differs radically from that of solid food. When one consumes an apple, the fiber matrix slows the digestion, and the act of chewing signals the hypothalamus to register caloric intake. When one drinks apple juice or a cola, there is no mastication, no fiber, and no resistance. The fluid passes through the pyloric sphincter of the stomach and floods the small intestine almost instantly. This results in a kinetic assault on the liver. The primary villain here is fructose. While glucose can be metabolized by every cell in the body for energy, fructose is metabolized almost exclusively by the liver. In the context of sugary drinks, which often contain high fructose corn syrup, HFCS, or sucrose, 50% fructose, the liver is subjected to a tsunami of substrate. Unlike glucose metabolism, which is tightly regulated by the enzyme phosphofructokinase, fructose metabolism is unregulated. It enters the glycolysis pathway downstream of the regulatory bottleneck. The liver has no choice but to process it, and when the energy demands of the liver are met, which they usually are in a sedentary
sedimentary state, this excess fructose is immediately converted into triglycerides via de novo lipogenesis. This process is the genesis of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFL.
A condition that is inextricably linked to type 2 diabetes. The fat created from liquid sugar does not just sit inertly, it lodges in the liver cells, hepatocytes, causing hepatic insulin resistance. This is the first domino. When the liver becomes insulin resistant, it forgets how to stop producing glucose. It begins to pump sugar into the bloodstream 24 hours a day, even when you are not eating. This creates the elevated fasting glucose levels seen in the early stages of the disease. Furthermore, the metabolism of fructose generates uric acid as a byproduct. High uric acid levels inhibit nixatzide, the molecule responsible for keeping blood vessels relaxed and open. This leads to hypertension and further damages the insulin signaling pathways. Thus, a daily soda habit is a multi-pronged attack. It fattens the liver, spikes the blood sugar, and stiffens the arteries simultaneously. Conversely, the role of pure water in diabetes prevention extends far beyond the simple absence of sugar. We must investigate the relationship between hydration status and the hormone vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone or ADH. Vasopressin is secreted by the hypothalamus when the body detects dehydration, high osmolality. Its primary job is to tell the kidneys to hold on to water. However, recent research has uncovered a sinister side to chronic low-grade dehydration. Vasopressin receptors are also found in the liver. When vasopressin levels are chronically high due to poor water intake, the hormone stimulates the liver to produce blood sugar, gluconeogenesis. Evolutionary biology offers an explanation. In ancient times, dehydration usually meant a lack of food and water, so the body pumped sugar into the blood to ensure the brain had fuel to survive the famine. In the modern context, many people exist in a state of chronic underhydration, drinking coffee and soda but little water. This keeps vasopressin elevated, which keeps blood sugar stubbornly high. By simply drinking adequate water, we suppress vasopressin, removing this hormonal drive for hyperglycemia. The directive to replace sweet drinks with water, unsweetened tea or lemon water, involves navigating the treacherous waters of addiction. Sugar triggers the nucleus accumbens in the brain, the same reward center activated by cocaine and heroin. The bliss point engineered by beverage companies is designed to maximize this dopamine release. Therefore,
the advice to reduce slowly week by week is rooted in the neuroscience of withdrawal and neuroplasticity. The taste buds and the brain undergo a process of adaptation. If a person accustomed to the intense sweetness of soda switches cold turkey to plain water, the water tastes flavorless, almost offensive. This is because the dopamine receptors have been downregulated. They are numb. However, the palate is plastic. By titrating down, mixing soda with water, or switching to seltzer with a splash of juice, over a period of weeks, the sensitivity of the taste buds returns. A strawberry begins to taste sweet again. The craving for the hypersweet stimulus fades as the brain's reward chemistry rebalances. We must also examine the cultural and environmental architecture that supports the consumption of sugary drinks. The big soda industry has spent billions embedding their products into the fabric of daily life, associating them with happiness, sports, and family gatherings. The ubiquity of these drinks makes them the default choice in many communities, particularly those with lower socioeconomic status, creating a disparity in diabetes rates. The shift to water is therefore a countercultural act. It is a rejection of the marketing narrative that hydration must be flavored, colored, and branded. It is a return to the biological baseline. The use of unsweetened tea or lemon water provides a bridge. The acidity of lemon or the tannins in tea provides sensory feedback, a mouthfeel, that helps satisfy the desire for something more complex than plain water, without the metabolic cost. Furthermore, the impact of hydration on kidney function is paramount for those at risk. The kidneys are the filtration units of the blood, and in a diabetic state they are under siege. Hyperfiltration, where the kidneys work overtime to filter excess glucose, leads to kidney damage, nephropathy. Adequate water intake reduces the workload on the kidneys by helping to clear glucose and toxins through urine. It dilutes the concentration of waste products. There is also evidence that drinking cold water can induce a small but non-negligible increase in thermogenesis, calorie burning, as the body expends energy to warm the fluid to body temperature. While this effect is minor compared to exercise, in the game of metabolic efficiency, every edge counts. The transition away from liquid sugar also forces a confrontation with liquid calories. It is possible to consume
1,000 calories of soda in minutes without feeling full. The satiety hormones PYY GLP-1 are largely unresponsive to liquid loads. By replacing these calories with water, one instantly creates a caloric deficit without experiencing the hunger pangs associated with food restriction. This facilitates the weight loss mandated in entry number 1. It is the low-hanging fruit of dietary intervention. For many patients, eliminating sugary drinks is the single action that reverses their prediabetes, proving that the poison was in the cup all along. The philosophical implication of this entry is a return to simplicity. The modern diet is characterized by an obsession with more flavor, more stimulation, more energy. Water represents less. It is neutral, calm, and cleansing. It is the universal solvent that facilitates every chemical reaction in the human body. When we choose water, we are choosing to facilitate the body's natural intelligence rather than hacking it with artificial stimulants. We are acknowledging that we are composed of
10. The surveillance protocol, the power of data and the predictive science of hemoglobin A1C.
The final entry in our investigative protocol, Get Regular Checkups, Fasting Glucose and HbA1c, is the fail-safe mechanism of the entire prevention strategy. It is the shift from subjective feeling to objective fact. Type 2 diabetes is uniquely insidious because it is a silent killer. The early stages of the disease, known as insulin resistance and prediabetes, are almost entirely asymptomatic. A person can walk around for a decade with dangerously high insulin levels and creeping blood sugar, feeling perfectly fine, while their pancreas slowly burns out and their microvasculature begins to rot. By the time symptoms appear, excessive thirst, frequent urination, blurred vision, approximately 50% of the beta cell function of the pancreas has already been permanently lost. Therefore, reliance on feeling healthy is a fatal error. The only defense is rigorous data-driven surveillance. To understand the power of this protocol, we must deeply analyze the biomarkers involved, specifically hemoglobin A1c, HbA1c. While fasting glucose gives a snapshot of blood sugar at a single moment in time, which can be affected by stress, sleep, or the dawn phenomenon, HbA1c is a time-lapse recording. Hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen. Glucose in the bloodstream has a tendency to stick to proteins, a process called glycation. Once a sugar molecule bonds to a hemoglobin molecule, it stays there for the life of the red blood cell, which is approximately 3 months, 120 days. Therefore, the HbA1c test measures the percentage of hemoglobin that is sugar-coated. It provides a weighted average of blood sugar levels over the past 90 days. It is a molecular truth teller that cannot be cheated by fasting for a few days before the doctor's appointment. The investigation into glycation reveals why this metric is so critical. The process of sugar binding to hemoglobin is a microcosm of what is happening to every protein in the body. This is the Maillard reaction, the same chemical browning process that happens when you sear a steak or toast bread, happening inside your veins at 98.6 degrees. This internal cooking creates advanced glycation end products, AGEs. These AGEs stiffen the collagen in blood vessels, leading to hypertension, cloud the lens of the eye, cataracts, and damage the delicate filtration mesh of the kidneys.
The HbA1c number is not just a score, it is a direct measure of the rate at which you are aging and rusting from the inside out. A normal A1c is below 5.7%, prediabetes is 5.7 to 6.4%, diabetes is 6.5% and above. However, the optimal range for longevity and disease prevention is likely below 5.4%. The gap between normal and optimal is where prevention lives. The protocol also calls for monitoring fasting glucose, but a truly deep dive requires us to look beyond just sugar and examine insulin. This is the hidden variable. In the early stages of metabolic dysfunction, the body can often keep blood sugar normal by pumping out massive amounts of insulin. This is a state of compensated insulin resistance. A standard checkup might show a normal glucose level of 90 milligrams per deciliter, leading the doctor to say, "You're fine." But if they tested fasting insulin, it might be sky high. The pancreas is working overtime to maintain that normalcy. This is like driving a car at 60 miles per hour in first gear. The speed is normal, but the engine is screaming. Eventually, the engine blows, beta cell failure, and only then does the blood sugar rise. Advocating for a fasting insulin test or a HOMA-IR, homeostatic model assessment for insulin resistance, score provides a warning sign years, sometimes decades, before the A1c rises. The what to do component, if results show prediabetes, follow a 3-month lifestyle plan and retest, capitalizes on the biology of the red blood cell turnover. Because the A1c reflects a 3-month average, this is the minimum window required to see biological proof of change. This feedback loop is psychologically crucial. When a patient sees a number, say 6.1%, it transforms the abstract threat of diabetes into a concrete reality. It serves as the wake-up call. Implementing the previous 9 protocols, weight loss, walking, fiber, sleep, etc. for 90 days, and then retesting provides a definitive return on investment. Seeing the number drop from 6.1% to 5.8% is incredibly empowering. It proves that the biology is malleable, that the genetic destiny can be rewritten. It turns the patient from a passive victim into an active biohacker. The historical context of diabetes diagnosis is a journey from the crude to the precise. In the 17th century, physicians diagnosed the pissing evil by tasting the urine of patients for sweetness. Today, we stand on the precipice of the cyborg era of metabolic health.
The advent of continuous glucose monitors, wearable sensors that measure interstitial fluid glucose 24/7, is revolutionizing prevention. While currently prescribed mostly for type 1 and advanced type 2 diabetics, these devices are becoming available to the pre-diabetic population. A CGM allows a person to see in real time exactly how a bowl of pasta affects their body compared to a bowl of lentils. It personalizes the data. It reveals that stress during a meeting spiked their sugar, or that a walk after dinner flattened the curve. This immediate biofeedback is the ultimate tool for behavioral change, far superior to a quarterly lab test. However, until CGMs are ubiquitous, the regular checkup remains the cornerstone of defense. This entry implies a shift in the doctor-patient relationship. It moves away from the paternalistic model, "the doctor will fix me when I break," to a partnership model, "I need data to manage my own machine." It requires the individual to ask questions. What is my exact number? How does this compare to last year? Can we test my insulin? It requires overcoming the fear of the result. Many avoid the doctor because they don't want to know. But in the realm of diabetes, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is gangrene.
dialysis, and blindness, knowledge is the only antidote. The implications of regularity are also economic and systemic. Our healthcare system is designed for sick care, intervening only when pathology is overt. Prevention requires a front-loading of resources. Catching a pre-diabetic at age 40 and reversing the trend through lifestyle costs a fraction of treating a diabetic for kidney failure at age 60. The checkup is the pivot point where this trajectory is altered. It is the moment where the family history is confronted with the current reality. Furthermore, the regular checkup serves as an accountability anchor. Knowing that you will be tested in 3 months creates a Hawthorne effect, the phenomenon where subjects improve their behavior simply because they are being observed. The scheduled blood draw acts as a deadline, a goalpost that keeps the daily behaviors of eating right and exercising focused. It prevents the drift back into old habits. In the final analysis, getting regular checkups is an act of stewardship over one's own body. It acknowledges that biological systems tend toward entropy and disorder if left unmonitored. For those with diabetes running in their family,
The genetic cards are stacked against them. The body is looking for an excuse to become diabetic. The surveillance protocol denies it that excuse. By shining the light of data into the dark corners of the metabolism, we expose the silent progression of the disease and arrest it. We use the numbers to validate our efforts, to course-correct our strategies, and ultimately to prove that while we may carry the genes of our ancestors, we are not bound to repeat their medical history. The top 10 ways to prevent type 2 diabetes culminate here, in the clear-eyed, courageous acceptance of the truth and the relentless, data-driven pursuit of optimal health.